September 20th, 1973. Houston Astrodome, Houston, Texas. Billie Jean King walked into the biggest tennis match of her life, but it did not feel like a normal tennis match. There were no quiet country club seats, no small crowd politely clapping after each point, no simple championship trophy waiting at the end. Inside the Astrodome, more than 30,000 people packed the stands, and tens of millions more were watching on television around the world. The match had been promoted like a circus, a sporting event, a political statement, and a public argument all at once. On one side was Billie Jean King, one of the best women's tennis players in the world. On the other side was Bobby Riggs, a 55-year-old former champion who had turned himself into one of the loudest men in sports. Riggs had spent months saying women's tennis was inferior. He said that even at his age, he could beat the best women in the world. He joked, bragged, taunted, and played the role of the showman perfectly. Some people thought it was all entertainment. Some thought it was harmless. But for Billie Jean King, it was much bigger than a joke. Because if she lost, millions of people would not just say, Bobby Riggs had beaten Billie Jean King. They would say, a 55-year-old man had proved women's sports did not deserve respect. That was the pressure. Billie Jean King was not only playing for herself, she was playing for women's tennis, women's athletes, and every girl who had been told that sports were not really for them. She had spent years fighting for equal prize money, better treatment, and respect for female athletes. Now, in one night, under the brightest lights tennis had ever seen, all of that work felt like it could be pushed backward. Riggs entered the court in a rickshaw pulled by women. King entered like Cleopatra, carried on a decorated litter by men. The entrances were ridiculous, dramatic, and made for television. But once the match began, the noise faded into something much more serious. Billie Jean King had to win, and she knew it. This is the story of the match that was bigger than tennis, how Billie Jean King faced Bobby Riggs in the battle of the sexes, how one exhibition match became a symbol for women's sports, why King carried more pressure than almost any athlete should have to carry, and how one night in Houston changed the way millions of people looked at women athletes. Billie Jean King was born on November 22nd, 1943, in Long Beach, California. Before she became one of the most important athletes in history, she was Billie Jean Moffitt, a girl growing up in a sports-loving family. Her younger brother, Randy Moffitt, would later become a Major League Baseball pitcher. Competition was part of her life early, and Billie Jean loved the feeling of testing herself. At first, she played softball. She was good at it, too. But when she discovered tennis, something changed. Tennis gave her a place to compete one-on-one, to think, move, react, and fight. The court became a space where she could prove herself, even when the world around her kept sending the message that girls' sports mattered less. From a young age, Billie Jean noticed unfairness. At tennis clubs, she saw that the sport often belonged to people with money and status. She saw that women were not treated the same as men. She saw that the best female players could be brilliant and still not receive the same attention, pay, or respect. That bothered her, and it never stopped bothering her. As she improved, her talent became impossible to ignore. She developed into a fierce competitor with quick movement, sharp instincts, and a strong net game. She was not the tallest or most physically overpowering player, but she was smart, intense, and mentally tough. She could adjust. She could solve problems during a match. She could handle pressure. Those qualities would matter later, when the pressure became bigger than tennis itself. By the 1960s, Billie Jean King had become one of the best players in the world. She won Wimbledon singles titles, doubles titles, and mixed doubles titles. She built a reputation as a champion who could perform on the biggest stages. But the better she became, the more obvious the inequality around her seemed. Men were paid more. Men received more attention. Men's tournaments were treated as more important. Women were expected to accept less and be grateful for it. Billie Jean King did not accept that. In 1970, she and a group of women players known as the Original Nine took a major risk. They signed symbolic $1 contracts and helped create a new women's professional tennis circuit. It was a bold move because they were challenging the tennis establishment. They were risking their careers to create better opportunities for women players. That fight eventually led to the formation of the Women's Tennis Association in 1973, with King as one of its central figures. That same year, the U.S. Open became the first major tournament to offer equal prize money to men and women, partly because of King's constant pressure and advocacy. Reuters notes that King founded the WTA and helped push for equal prize money at the U.S. Open in 1973. So by the time Bobby Riggs entered the story, Billie Jean King was already more than a tennis player. She was a champion, she was an organizer, she was an activist. She was one of the main people trying to build a future where women athletes were taken seriously. That is what made the Riggs challenge so dangerous. Bobby Riggs had once been a great tennis player. In the 1930s and 1940s, he had been among the best men in the world. He won Wimbledon, the U.S. Championships, and other major titles. But by 1973, he was long retired from top-level professional tennis. He was 55 years old. But Riggs understood attention. He knew how to sell a story. He knew how to get cameras pointed at him. He knew how to make people angry, amused, and curious all at once. In 1973, he began saying that women's tennis was so weak that he could still beat the best women players in the world. He called himself a male chauvinist. He made jokes. He gave interviews. He turned the challenge into a show. But behind the showmanship was something real. The world was already arguing about women's rights, equal pay, Title IX, and the changing role of women in American life. Riggs stepped directly into that argument and made himself the symbol of one side. He was not just saying he could beat a woman in tennis. He was saying the women's game itself was inferior. At first, Riggs wanted to play Billie Jean King, but she refused. She did not want to give him the spotlight. She did not want to turn women's tennis into a stunt. She believed the movement was too important to be reduced to a circus act. Then Margaret Court accepted. Court was one of the greatest women's tennis players of all time. She had won more major titles than almost anyone in history. In 1973, she was still a huge name. And if anyone could shut Riggs up, many people thought Court could. The match took place on May 13, 1973, Mother's Day, in Ramona, California. It became known as the Mother's Day Massacre. Bobby Riggs beat Margaret Court easily, 6-2, 6-1. Riggs used drop shots, lobs, spins, and tricks to throw Court off balance. He did not overpower her like a young male athlete. He outmaneuvered her, frustrated her, and turned the match into exactly the kind of spectacle he wanted. Suddenly, Riggs was everywhere. He was on magazine covers. He was giving interviews. He was mocking women's tennis even louder than before. And now, Billie Jean King knew she had to play him. The court loss changed everything. If King still refused, Riggs would keep using the win as proof. He would keep saying the best women could not beat him. The public would keep listening. Women's tennis could become a punchline at the exact moment King and others were fighting to build it into something stronger. So Billie Jean King accepted. The match was scheduled for September 20th, 1973, at the Houston Astrodome. It would be called the Battle of the Sexes. The name was dramatic, but the pressure behind it was real. The match would have a winner-take-all prize of $100,000. It would be televised in prime time. The audience would be massive. Billie Jean King's official site says about 50 million people watched in the United States and around 90 million worldwide, while King defeated Riggs 6-4, 6-3, 6-3. King later said she felt that if she lost, it could set women's tennis back for years. That may sound extreme, but in the moment, it made sense. Women athletes were still fighting for basic respect. Title IX had only been signed into law the year before, in 1972. Women's professional sports were still treated like a novelty by many people. A loss to Riggs would have given critics exactly what they wanted. Riggs trained for the match, but he also sold it like a performer. He posed for cameras. He made jokes. He leaned into the villain role. He knew that the more outrageous he acted, the more people would watch. Billie Jean King prepared differently. She studied him. She watched how he had beaten Margaret Court. She understood that Riggs was not going to try to blast winners past her. He was going to use junk. He was going to use spins, lobs, drop shots, changes of pace, and mental games. He wanted her impatient. He wanted her reaching. He wanted her angry. King knew she could not fall into that trap. She needed to stay disciplined. She needed to keep him moving. She needed to attack his weakness. Most of all, she needed to control the match instead of the spectacle. That was not easy, because everything around the match was spectacle. The Houston Astrodome wasn't a tennis arena. It was a massive stadium, nicknamed the eighth wonder of the world. Turning it into a tennis venue made the match feel enormous. The court sat in the middle of the building like a stage. The crowd was huge. The lights were bright. The television broadcast turned every entrance, gesture, and reaction into part of the show. Riggs loved that environment. King had to survive it. Before the match, the entrances made the event feel almost unreal. King came in like Cleopatra, carried by men. Riggs arrived in a rickshaw pulled by women. The whole thing looked absurd, but it matched the promotion. This was not being sold as a quiet sporting contest. It was being sold as a battle over pride, gender, and public opinion. Then the match began, and Billie Jean King immediately showed that she was not there to play Riggs's game. Riggs wanted to slow points down and make them awkward. He wanted to use soft shots, angles, and spins. But King had a plan. She attacked his backhand. She moved him side to side. She stayed patient when he tried to make points strange. She did not let the crowd, the jokes, or the pressure pull her away from the strategy. The first set was tight. That mattered, because if King started badly, the pressure would grow even heavier. Riggs did not need to dominate early to create doubt. He only needed to make the match uncomfortable. Every game he won gave his supporters hope. Every close point reminded viewers that King was carrying something much bigger than a tennis score. But King stayed composed. She broke Riggs late in the first set and won it 6-4. That first set changed the feeling inside the Astrodome. Riggs was no longer just performing. He was in trouble. King had taken control, and she had done it without panic. In the second set, she became even stronger. She kept Riggs moving, forced him to play more physically than he wanted, and refused to give away cheap points. Riggs tried his tricks, but King was ready. She understood that the match was not about hitting the flashiest shots. It was about making him work again and again until the old champion ran out of answers. King won the second set 6-3. Now she was one set away. One set away from ending the circus. One set away from protecting women's tennis from the humiliation Riggs wanted to create. One set away from turning his own show against him. By the third set, Riggs was fading. He had talked for months, but talking could not help him now. King was fitter, sharper, younger, and more prepared. She had not only matched the moment, she had taken it over. The final set moved toward the ending that millions of people were now beginning to understand. Billie Jean King was going to win. She closed it out 6-3, straight sets, 6-4, 6-3, 6-3. The match was over. Billie Jean King had beaten Bobby Riggs. The battle of the sexes had ended with the woman everyone was watching doing exactly what she said she had to do. Britannica describes the match as a major spectacle and a significant moment in the women's movement of the 1970s. The reaction was immediate. For many women watching, the victory felt personal. It was not simply about tennis. It was about seeing someone stand under enormous pressure and refuse to fold. It was about watching a woman athlete be mocked, challenged, doubted, turned into a symbol, and then win clearly. King did not beat Riggs in a lucky moment. She beat him in straight sets. That mattered. There was no excuse, no close fifth set, no controversial ending, no strange finish. She outplayed him. The match that had been designed as a spectacle became a statement. For Bobby Riggs, the defeat did not destroy him personally. He and King later became friendly, and Riggs admitted she had played well. In some ways, he had also gotten what he wanted: attention. The event became one of the most watched sporting events of its time, but the cultural meaning belonged to King. She had taken the stage Riggs built and used it to prove the opposite of what he wanted. That is what made the night so powerful. Billie Jean King understood that the match was not a perfect test of men's tennis versus women's tennis. Riggs was 55, long past his prime, and using showmanship as much as athleticism. But she also understood that the public did not always think in careful details. If she lost, people who already dismissed women's sports would use it as proof. So she removed the proof. She won. And by winning, she gave women's tennis a massive public victory at a time when the sport needed one. The match did not solve everything. Women athletes still had to fight for equal pay. They still had to fight for media attention. They still had to fight for respect. They still had to fight for opportunities. But the battle of the sexes became a moment they could point to. It became a symbol of women performing under pressure and winning when the whole world was watching. That is why the title fits. The match that was bigger than tennis. Because it was. The score was tennis. The meaning was bigger. It was about who got taken seriously. It was about who got paid. It was about who got watched. It was about who got mocked and who got believed. It was about whether women athletes would be treated as competitors or entertainment. Billie Jean King knew all of that before she walked onto the court. That is why the win meant so much. She was not just trying to beat Bobby Riggs. She was trying to protect years of progress. And she did. After 1973, King continued to be one of the most important figures in sports. She won 39 major titles across singles, doubles, and mixed doubles during her career. She kept fighting for equality in sports and beyond. She became one of the most respected voices in athletics, not only for what she did on the court, but for what she changed off it. Decades later, her influence is still visible. The WTA became one of the most important women's sports organizations in the world. Equal prize money became a major issue across tennis and other sports. Girls who watched King win saw a different future for themselves. Women, athletes who came after her, inherited a sport that had been changed by her courage. In 2024, Billie Jean King became the first individual female athlete to receive the Congressional Gold Medal, recognizing her contributions to sports and equality. Reuters reported that the legislation honored her career, her role in founding the WTA, her fight for equal prize money, and her impact beyond tennis. That honor shows how far the meaning of the battle of the sexes traveled. It was not just remembered as a strange 1970s television event. It became part of American sports history, part of women's sports history, part of the story of equality. But to understand why it mattered, you have to return to the moment before the match began. Billie Jean King was 29 years old. She was at the top of her sport, but she was also carrying the weight of something larger than herself. Millions were watching. Many wanted her to win. Many wanted her to lose. Some people were laughing at the whole idea. Others understood how serious it felt. Bobby Riggs had spent months turning the match into a joke. King had to turn it into a victory. That is a very different kind of pressure. A normal athlete can lose and move on. Billie Jean King felt like if she lost, other people would pay for it too. That is what makes her performance so impressive. She did not play wild. She did not get dragged into the show. She did not try to win every point with anger. She played smart, patient tennis. She took the match seriously when the world around it looked ridiculous. That is how she beat him, not just with power, with discipline. Riggs wanted chaos. King gave him control. Riggs wanted to embarrass women's tennis. King made him chase. Riggs wanted the spotlight. King took the match. There is a reason people still talk about that night more than 50 years later. It had all the pieces of a legendary sports story. The loud challenger, the serious champion, the giant stadium, the massive audience, the cultural argument, and the final result that made the whole world react. But it also had something deeper. It had timing. The early 1970s were a moment when women were fighting loudly for more rights, more opportunity, and more respect. Sports were part of that fight. Billie Jean King was part of that fight. The battle of the sexes happened at exactly the right time for one tennis match to feel like it represented a much larger movement. That is why the match could never be just tennis. Every serve carried meaning. Every point carried tension. Every game moved the argument. And when King won the final point, it felt like something had been released. For women who had been laughed at, dismissed, or told they did not belong, the victory gave them a moment of proof. For young girls who wanted to play sports, it gave them a hero. For men watching at home, it forced many to take women athletes more seriously than they had before. Not everyone changed overnight, but the image changed. Billie Jean King had stood in the middle of the Astrodome and won. That could not be undone. The match also showed something important about pressure. Pressure does not always come from the opponent across the net. Sometimes it comes from the people watching, the expectations around you, and the consequences people attach to the result. King had to manage all of that while still playing tennis. She had to return serve. She had to choose shots. She had to move her feet. She had to breathe. She had to stay calm. That is what makes the performance easy to underestimate. People remember the cultural impact and sometimes forget that she still had to win a tennis match against a former champion who was skilled, tricky, and experienced. Riggs may have been older, but he was not helpless. He had already beaten Margaret Court badly. He knew how to frustrate elite players. He knew how to use the spotlight. He knew how to make opponents uncomfortable. King solved him. That is the athletic achievement underneath the historical achievement. She did not only carry the moment, she executed the plan. When the match ended, Billie Jean King had done more than defeat Bobby Riggs. She had taken a public challenge designed to question women's sports and turned it into one of the greatest victories in the history of women's athletics. That is why the match still matters. That is why it became a movie. That is why people still write about it. That is why it is taught, discussed, replayed, and remembered. Because sometimes a sporting event becomes a mirror for the world around it. In 1973, Billie Jean King versus Bobby Riggs reflected arguments people were already having in homes, schools, workplaces, and stadiums. The match gave those arguments a scoreboard. And the scoreboard said Billie Jean King won. The final score was 6-4, 6-3, 6-3. But the real victory was larger than 3 sets. It was a victory for women's tennis, a victory for women athletes, a victory for the idea that respect should not have to be begged for when it has already been earned. On September 20th, 1973, Billie Jean King entered the Astrodome as a champion carrying a burden. She left as something more. She left as proof. Proof that the jokes could be answered. Proof that the pressure could be survived. Proof that a woman athlete could stand on one of the biggest stages in sports and win when millions were watching. Bobby Riggs built the show. Billie Jean King changed the meaning of it. And that is why the Battle of the Sexes was never just a tennis match. It was the night Billie Jean King walked onto a court, carried more than a racket, and won for more than herself.